Okay, great. All right, so we're going to get started. Are you excited? Everybody can see it. Excellent. I'm excited too. So this is now my second webinar. For those of you who were not able to come to the last webinar, I hope that you know that the recording of that webinar will be in your system shortly. You notice probably that Joseph has created a new section, and it's called Are You Ready? Now that section also contains the questions that we included in the checklists from the last session. So if you haven't gotten a chance to take a look at it, you can definitely go ahead and take a look at it later today, and you'll be able to use them to help you improve your studies and your study methods. So this particular webinar is going to be a little bit different, and we're really excited about it because it's going to probably begin a series of webinars, and it's going to be about defeating common errors that are costing you TOEFL points. So for today's webinar, what we're going to focus on is pretty much just one specific skill, and it's going to have an impact on both writing and speaking. But for future webinars, we will be discussing other issues. So I hope today we can pretty much discuss just this particular skill set. And then at the end, what we're going to do is have a short Q&A session. This means that if you have any common study questions that you need answers to, we are going to try our best to answer them today for you. And again, this is being recorded, so it will be in your system at a later time. So don't worry if it's not right up right away. All right, so let's go ahead. So this particular webinar, the reason why we're creating them, I think this is important to go over quickly. The reason why is because we want to make sure that you have the key study tips that you need to improve your responses and your scores. Now when you're a self-study student, it can be a little bit tricky to know exactly what to do. From the last webinar, like I discussed before, we talked about how to study effectively, how to divide your time, and how to use that time as wisely as possible. So for today, in this kind of session, we're going to talk about some of the specifics of improving, meaning the strategies, and kind of walk you through that. All right, and it's also going to be, like I said, an opportunity for you to ask your questions. Some of you also, I just wanted to go to my introduction quickly because some of you I think were not in the last week's webinar. So just to introduce again, my name is Lauren, and I've been an English language instructor for 7 years. 5 of those years were in China, and I helped a lot of students get into exclusive programs, university programs, not just with TOEFL training, but also IELTS and general English training. So that's where I gained a lot of my experience. When I returned, Joseph asked me on to Noteful, and I've been working with him ever since to improve all of the programs that you're working with, the tutoring sessions that you participate in, and also the reviews that you receive from Megan, and which you will probably receive in the future from other instructors that come along too. So let's go on to the actual lesson. So just as a kind of a recap, from last week's webinar we talked about asking yourself specific questions in order to help yourself move forward more efficiently. And the question we're going to be focusing on today is, can I think of reasons and examples? I wanted to talk about this question because I felt that it's something that, regardless of how hard students work, sometimes there's still the answer no to this question. All right, so this is from our checklist. Again, you can find this question in Are You Ready? And you're also going to see some answers there, and some of those answers you might not really recognize because they're pretty new. So we're going to talk about some of those new strategies, the ones that are not in your Step 3 section yet. Okay, so part 1 is just a brief review. So I just want to let you know that this part's going to go a little bit quickly because it's already in your system. So if you think I'm talking a little bit too quickly through this section, I'm sorry, I will try to slow down, but I want to make sure that we go through it more quickly so that we can kind of just jump ahead to the part that you don't really, or some of you who aren't in tutoring will not know about yet. So when you answer independent questions, a lot of you in your tutoring sessions are going to say a lot of the same things to me. And when you ask yourself these questions and your answer is no, then this is the webinar for you, right? So does your 15 seconds go by too quickly? Does it take you a long time to get started writing your essays? Do you feel like you never know what to talk or write about? Do you have experience thinking back to personal experience? Do you feel that sometimes you can't think of an experience? Is there stuttering in your speech, and is there repetition in your content? So if you answered no to these questions related to the independent question type, then, like I said, this webinar is definitely for you. So we're going on to the strategies that are already in your system. So these ones you know, it's a review, so you may not need to write them. But if you haven't reviewed great content yet, then please start to write these down now. So the first thing you'll discover from some of the videos that are in your system is that your reasons should be short and simple. You're going to be building and using a reason and example cheat sheet, right? And all of this will help you to build. Somebody is giving me a comment. I just want to make sure I understand what that is. It says my screen is hanging on. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what that means. Maybe you can clarify that point. But in any case, let's go on to the next point. Using contrasting examples, provide a second example for the same reason, provide details. This means names, places, figures, dates. All of those crucial pieces of information are very important. Using examples that are based in truth, that's something that I think a lot of you struggle with, but that's something that we have to shoot for, because if we don't, number one, we may not be able to speak fluently. We may not be able to come up with answers in 15 seconds. And also when writing essays, we may not be able to write an essay completely, all right, or at least as quickly as we'd like. For writing, we also talk about great content tips. The same things apply basically for the writing that you see in your speaking, but also we suggest that you outline your essay before you type it out. You walk your reader through the experience. And this means basically you're going to tell the full story, not just what happened from A to B, but also from the beginning to the middle to the end. Give your reader the complete picture. You're also going to be interjecting, which means including some thoughts too, right? So for example, you might want to say, I felt that it was very uncomfortable, or I was really unhappy about this. You might want to add some feelings as well to the story, because this can increase your word count and your content. So these are some of the strategies already in your Step 3 great content. I see some questions already coming in, and I'm going to definitely answer some of them at the Q&A. So I just want to let you know to hold off some of your questions about any of the information at this point until the end. If you have questions that come up through the information that I'm discussing now, we will have time for brief questions at the end of each slide. All right, so I'm just afraid that if you send in too many questions, I won't be able to see them, and I don't want you to think I'm ignoring you, okay? It's hard to see them all as they come in. So this was the review. We're going right away to part 2 because this is the important part. All right, so these are the new strategies for improving independent content. So the reason why I created this, I wanted to talk about it briefly before you read these steps and before we go into them. The reason why I created these steps was, well, for a couple of reasons. First, in tutoring sessions, I noticed that regardless of all of the great help and all of the great strategies in Step 3, some students were still having difficulty. Some students were still unsure about how to move forward. Students were still kind of going through their content too slowly or not really coming up with great details or examples. Another reason why I created this was because actually I had the problem too, right? And so I always tell my students this who are in tutoring, because I think it's important for you to realize that the reason why you're struggling with these questions is not necessarily because you have a difficulty with English, but because you're having difficulty coming up with the examples quickly, right? And that's something that also native speakers experience. Okay, so the reason why native speakers experience this is because I think that, some of us sometimes when we see a question for the first time, it does shock us too. We're like, well, I never thought of this before. I don't really have an opinion about this. It's not something I very much considered in my life. So now I only have 15 seconds to develop an opinion about it, and now I'm stuck. Right? So that's why I created this. And over time, it's developed into 3 steps. So I'm going to go over that one by one. So again, if it's confusing, we'll go through this part very slowly, and there will be time for questions. So step 1 is essentially to use the keywords from the question to think of your examples first. Now I know that a lot of you in your system, when you go through your system, you are actually thinking in the opposite direction. You're thinking of the answer to the question first. You think, oh, what do I think about this? What's my opinion? Do I prefer A or B? Do I agree or disagree? So when you're thinking of it in that way, you're focusing on your opinion. And from that point, you tend to think of your reasons, right? You're trying to think of, well, why do I think this? What is my opinion about this? I don't really know why. And so by the time we get through those steps, I feel that most students tend to run out of the 15 seconds. The 15 seconds are up, and then it's time to speak, and then we have to kind of come up with fast examples as quickly as we can. And what I've seen in my sessions is that most students don't really have this strong ability, right? Because being very quick and on the spot requires a great level of fluency and a very high range of vocabulary just to be able to kind of speak comfortably and naturally. Right? So this is where this comes in. Now, from the next step, step 2, you're going to basically use those real experiences to build your answer. So instead of kind of thinking of your answer, then your reasons, then your experiences and examples, you're going to be thinking of your examples first, as step 1 states, and they're going to use those real experiences to build your answer. So that's kind of the tricky part, and I know this sounds complicated, but we're going to simplify it step by step. So don't worry if it's still confusing at this time. Step 3 is actually the response portion of your answer. So you've already prepared, your 15 seconds is up, now you have 45 seconds. You're going to use a question word checklist as you respond. Now there's something similar to this that's already in great content. You know that in the video Joseph explains there's an example sentence that says when I was at, right? It kind of outlines how you might want to start your story. But I think that when you have a question checklist in front of you, you remember them as cues, and you remember them as crucial details and points that you're going to need to go through as you're speaking. And it's a little bit easier to have them as those kind of prompts, right? So again, if you have questions, we're going to slow it way down now. So don't worry if you're confused yet, or if you think this sounds too complicated. Okay, so we're going to start by just looking at a question. This is a pretty standard question that we'll see on the TOEFL exam. It might be for writing, it might be for speaking. Do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Universities should give more money to their students' sports activities than they give to their university libraries. Use specific reasons and examples to support your opinion. Okay, so for this particular question, you notice that for step 1 we talked about identifying key words. Right, so here you can see I've already put these words in bold. So universities is a keyword, sports is a keyword, libraries is a keyword. So essentially what I'm going to be doing in my 15 seconds is I'm going to look at those keywords and I'm going to identify, what do I have experience with? Which one of these things do I relate to? And personally, I don't really have too many sports-related experiences. Some of you might, and that's great. Some of you might decide to favor sports. Personally, I've spent the last few years of my life in libraries, so this should be very simple. I'm going to use libraries, and I already know what kinds of examples I can use. So as I continue on with step 1, as you can see, we start off with this idea of libraries, but we're going to our specific we're building from our specific examples. So here you can see some information that you probably don't recognize, right? Some of you who may know me know that I'm also in college too, right? I go to school and I'm also a student. So some of these experiences are detailed, right? It says, number 1, missing books at Hunter College. So there was a time when I couldn't find a book at my university library, right? So I'm going to think of that experience. Another experience I come up with is a time I was writing a research paper for a Shakespeare class. So these are two independent experiences, and actually it doesn't really matter if they're positive or negative experiences, because number one is actually a negative experience. Not finding books is not really a good thing, right? On the other hand, I also have a positive experience where I did this research paper. So it was actually a good experience, and I can also use that to support libraries, right? So using that step, I want to ask if there's any questions about this specific element at this time. Step one, using the keywords to identify what our example is, and then coming up with real concrete experiences from those keywords. Is there any questions, or are there any questions at this time about that step? Yes? No? No. Somebody says no. Anybody else? Okay, so I hope this is clear so far. Somebody has a yeah. So if you have a yeah answer, okay, I see somebody says I have a question. It is clear, but I think some people might have questions, so I'm going to pause. If you have a question, please just type it out. None of you will be able to see the question, but you all should be able to see my answer when I respond. So are there any questions? Taking time also in thinking. Yes, it is going to take you some time, and we're going to get to that, but one of the things to note is when you start to develop this skill of quickly thinking of your example from the keyword, you're going to start to see that some of these things are coming from your example cheat sheet, and some of these things are just going to come more naturally because you're developing a skill. The more you do it, the faster you will become at it. So yes, you only have 15 seconds in your speaking, and of course you don't have too much time to think in your writing either, but as the skill is built, it becomes faster. Somebody asked about the example cheat sheet. Now, for those of you who don't know what this is something that's already in your system. All right, cheat sheet, example cheat sheet. I'm going to write this one out. This is in step 3. Great content. So it's a review of something you should know from your system. All right, but if you don't, you can go ahead and review it. Okay, somebody asked me, if we have no experience, what should we do? Now the thing is, I don't agree with the fact that we don't have any experiences. These questions are all familiar topics, and I think that Joseph hosted a webinar not too long ago about this. He was talking about how it doesn't matter what the question is, we can always think of something. And I think that you're going to find that there are questions that don't seem connected to your life, but there's got to be some way. And we're going to go over a couple of other questions that are a little more difficult so we can see how we can connect to this. All right, so I just want to let you know that's something that we will cover as well as we go through the questions. Okay, so I want to go to the next step now, if that's okay. I know some of you still have some questions. Somebody asked me, can you bring another 2 examples? I will. We're going to get to that. We're just going to go through this question step by step first. Okay, so step 2. Step 2 is basically build your answer. And this means you're going to use the examples you kind of thought of very quickly, your past experiences with a library. In my case, I already have them here. And you're going to use them to build your answer. Now, this is probably what will seem like the most complicated to you, and it may seem like it's going to take a long time for you to go through this process. But if you're experienced, again, it's something that becomes very quick. And I know this because I've seen students do it. I also know this because I've done it, and other instructors have too. So I just want to make sure you're aware that while it seems complex and long now, it's something that you'll build and become much more quick with. All right, so with that, I want to go through it step by step. So when you're thinking of your experience, yeah, you know you went to a library once and you couldn't find a book you were looking for, right? So why was this an important experience? That's the first question you're going to kind of ask yourself really quickly. It's not even going to take a minute. It's going to take less than a second. You're basically just going to say why, right? And in my case, I know why this was important, right? You're going to have your own reasons, but mine is because I spent a lot of money on books because there were none in the library, right? So how do I develop a reason from that? Well, for sure, you can go back to your reason cheat sheet, which is the same as the the example cheat sheet. But I also think that you can use this to connect to the question itself, right? So how to do that? You're saying, well, what's the reason for spending money on libraries then? How does this connect to that? In my case, I'm going to say, well, it will help students save money. So essentially, I'm going to say that universities should spend more money on libraries for two reasons. First, it will help students save money. And now, while my listener doesn't know what that means necessarily, I'm going to explain it using this story about missing books at Hunter College. Right, so again, it seems very complicated, but we'll walk through it one more time. So the second example I came up with was just that time I wrote a research paper for a Shakespeare class. Again, I'm asking myself that quick question, why? What's the significance? Well, I did really well on that paper. So what's my reason? Why should why should universities spend money on libraries? Well, I think it can help students improve grades, right? So as you can see, one's a negative, one's a positive, but they both come back to the idea, the general idea of libraries, all right? So now that we've completed step 2, I want to ask if there are any questions. All right, I know it's tough to kind of grasp this. We will go through more. But if there are any questions about this process, let me know now. Somebody says, can I say everyone does not play sports, but everyone used the library? Can I use it as one reason? I think that you can perhaps, but you have to be able to think of the example. And what that means is you have to have an example of a time when you went to a library, right? So if you don't have that experience, then that's not going to necessarily be the best reason for you, right? I think that surely is an easy reason to use, but what we're focusing on today is the experience end, right? I know a lot of you tend to kind of worry a lot about the reasons, and I think that when you focus so much on them, you tend to worry in the wrong direction. What I mean by that is the examples are really where the priority is. As I talked about in the beginning of this lesson, was that the examples are the most time is spent in your examples, right? The most time is spent not only in your speaking but also in your writing. They're the heart of your answer. So if they're not there, if they're missing, if they're not really strong because you spent so much time worrying about reasons, then that's not going to be a strong answer regardless. So who cares about the reason, right? That's what I'm trying to illustrate today. So finding that example first or finding that experience first, I think, is your #1 priority. Okay, so let me see if there's any other questions. Any other questions about this specific element? Okay, somebody says, how can I say it in 45 seconds? Well, that's the next step we're going to get to. We're going to talk about the question checklist that I discussed for step 3. All right, and we're also going to not talk about time management today, but it does come back to managing your time. For example, if you find that you're spending too much time on example 1, then that means you're going to have to cut back some of the elements of the details. So you're going to see through my answers as I go through them how you might want to explain these just very simply, but with maintaining the detail. Somebody is asking me if the cheat sheet is the 180 example questions. No, it's not. 180 example questions is from step 2, and it's just a list of questions you can use to practice. The cheat sheet is essentially a strategy. Cheat sheet is when you build your examples and you build a list of your reasons so that you can kind of remember them and refer to them in the future. And this is something that you'll find in actually step 3. Right, step 3, content, great content, actually. All right, and that's something you'll want to review if you're unclear on that. Somebody said, should it be a personal example? Okay, so one of the things is, one of the things that we urge in tutoring sessions is that it should be a personal example, but not everybody has one. So say, for example, you're a mother, it's been a really long time since you've been to the library. And you know that you have children who also utilize libraries. Maybe they had some kind of project that was due, but you remember the struggle they had or the positive experience they had. Then of course you can use your child's experience, but you're going to not represent it as your own. you're going to represent it as your child's experience. You're going to say, for example, last week, my son had an assignment about blah, 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 right? So yes, you can use other people's experiences. And as you also know from your system, you can also use things you've read about, right? So say, for example, you read an article recently about how they're defunding sports, right? You can also talk about it using that article you read. I think that's a little trickier to do because a lot of us don't really remember articles verbatim, meaning word for word, and we don't really remember all the facts and details. But that's why I think more personalized experiences are more helpful. All right, they are more helpful to contribute to better fluency. All right, so I hope that makes sense. I'm going to move on now. So if you have any more questions about this step, we will have time for them after. Okay. So let's go on. One quick question. Somebody asked me, is it necessary to give an example for every essay? The answer is absolutely yes. Right? The whole purpose of this is that you show support. Right? For both question 1 and 2 for speaking and both question 2 for writing, you're going to need to give support. Otherwise, you don't have the bulk of your answer, right? Otherwise, you're just, I believe this, I have a reason. Right? If you don't have that, if you don't have anything beyond that, then you're not really going to have much to say or much to write about. And therefore our word count's going to be low and we're not going to finish, right? So that's very important. So let's go on to the next slide. So the next slide is the response element of your answer. So this is when you're ready, 45 seconds set, it's time to speak. Now this is something that I've just recently developed and I think it's going to be very helpful. I've seen students excel with it. Some students still struggle to apply it. So just remember, you need your example first because if you don't really have one, then you're going to end up making up answers to these questions, and I think that this is also going to contribute to poor fluency. So just make sure that you have these questions in front of you as you're practicing. Are you going to need to do this at the TOEFL? Are you going to have time to write all this out at the TOEFL? Probably not. But if you start building the skill of always answering these questions in your practice time, then eventually you're not going to necessarily need to write when, where, who, what, why, how, right? Because it's already going to be something so mastered, so ingrained, that you're just going to quickly go through it as you deliver your response. So I know that's the ideal situation, but again, it does take practice to get to that point. Some people are going to apply it immediately. Other people, it's going to take time. So let's just look at those questions. Right? The first one is when. The next one is where. The next one is who. So these three questions, I think we almost always have a when and a where. Sometimes we won't have a who. For example, it might be a story just about yourself. So for example, you might be saying, for example, when I was in the library last semester at Hunter College, the end, right? You're not going to say any more about who is involved. But it's definitely there, so in case you do have somebody in your story, you know to say, my friend Ashley, or my boss, or my mother. You're going to say who's involved, right? You're not going to forget that. Also of note, oftentimes these three answers, when, where, who, are typically going to be in the same sentence. So you can probably bang that out very quickly, right? You're going to say, last semester, when I was going to Hunter College, my history professor. So there's a continuation, right? And I'm going to finish that sentence with one of the answers to what, or one of the answers to my what question. All right, my history professor asked us to read a really expensive book called Major Problems in the U.S. All right, so I'm adding a lot of details here, but I just want you to know and see what you're going to say, what kinds of information you're going to say for the what. One of the major issues I notice in tutoring sessions is that when students have a reason, so say for example, it helps students save money, right? That's your reason. Now when it comes time to the example, you may be able to say the when, where, who. You may say last semester when I was going to Hunter College, I had to get a book, but I had to spend the money and I think it will help students save money. The end. Right? That kind of answer is going to definitely remain a fair because you're not really telling me anything that happened. Right? So basically the what question is what happened. right? What happened? Don't just repeat your reason. Don't just go straight to your connection. You know, that's where we're going to see fair scores. So if you say, for example, he told me that, you know, if we didn't want to spend the money, we could find it at the library. However, when I went to find the text, all the copies were reserved, so I had to purchase it for $65. Now, I'm going to get to the why and how. So this kind of serves as the same function. It's going to be the section where you discuss how is this connected, right? How is this connected back to that answer I gave earlier? Or why are libraries important? Those are the questions you're going to kind of ask yourself, and that's what you're going to be answering here. So again, as you practice, try to answer as many of these questions as you can and keep them in front of you. So when you're delivering your response, you know the format, you know the structure, and you know how to organize your thoughts in a way that will allow you to deliver a clear, strong, powerful answer. All right, so I hope that that's clear. Somebody asked me a question, so I'm going to take a moment to answer it. Okay, I will look at a few. Somebody says, okay, I went to find the text, this sentence missing to after went, or it works without it. I think that what you're asking me is, will it work without these questions? You know, will it work without them? I think it should, but the problem is I think that most students, when they're speaking, they tend to kind of go through it with a very disorganized way. And I think that sometimes you just, whatever occurs to you in that moment, you just kind of go with it. And then what I see is usually that repetition of the key point, right? So I saved money, and so I saved money, and because I saved money, it was really great for me, right? And so when that occurs, you know, there's so much repetition there, you're not showing your grader that you have a high-level vocabulary. You're just not, right? So you may think that you've answered the question right, but you definitely didn't answer it with high-level vocabulary. So that's sometimes why I think some students are confused after their TOEFL exam. They see, I got a 23, I don't know what happened. But I say, well, did you explain why why you didn't want to spend so much money? And then they say, well, I just said it was expensive. Well, you're going to need to add a little bit more than that. You're going to tell me what happened. And also of note, because this is a truthful experience, you don't have to create it. You know, I know a lot of students also tend to kind of try to translate in their mind or try to just come up with words. So when that happens, I think students tend to go off topic. Like, for example, if your reason is it's easier. I notice if you don't have a really good example or truthful example, some students will just go, and it was easier for me, and because of that, I didn't spend too much time, and it was just more convenient, right? So a lot of students tend to just describe, you know, how they felt. They don't really tell me what happened. And because of that, they end up going off topic. As you can see, easier and convenient might not necessarily be the same thing, and faster is definitely not the same thing. You're actually just providing more reasons on top of it, right? You're not describing the story. You're not describing what happened. All right, so I hope that clears up the question. Okay. Somebody asked, can you explain about what again? It essentially just means what happened, right? It means what happened in your example so that you can explain to your grader why you feel this way, right? If you feel that students shouldn't have to spend money on books and libraries are important for that reason, then you need to explain your story. You know, what happened to you? Why do you think this way? This is my story. So you can see from my experience, I actually told you my truthful experience. This is what happened to me in my life. So I have the words to express and communicate that. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to go on to the next one. Well, I keep saying I'm going to go on, but I have a good question. It says, what do you mean about high vocabulary? This basically means, like, for example, if you just say faster, 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 it's great, my friend, it's faster, you know, that was not organized, but you get the idea. There's not very many nouns here. There's not very many interesting words. There's not a range of words. So when you're delivering an answer and you're just kind of repeating some very basic vocabulary, not really saying too much, then that means your vocabulary is at a lower level, right? You're showing to the grader that you're not able to use more vocabulary words. You know, it doesn't have to be crazy academic. As you can see in my answer, you know, the longest word here is probably expensive. And I think that you all are probably familiar with that word, right? So it's not high-level vocabulary in the sense that it's advanced, but it's showing that I have a range. You know, I'm not just saying it's cheaper, it's cheaper, it's cheaper. I'm also saying it's expensive. It cost $65. There were no copies, right? The book was called. I spent a lot of money. So you see I'm using a variety of vocabulary words to express an idea or an event that occurred in my life. That's what I mean by a high-level vocabulary. Okay, so going on. Okay, so step 3 again. Just to, I'm sorry. Oop, we're moving on. Okay, we're going to part 3. So what I want to do is quickly just practice using these strategies. Okay, so I want to give you a new question, and I'm going to give it to you now. So I'm going to prompt you to tell me what the key words are. I'm sure some of you are going to tell me the right ones. Some of you might choose inaccurate ones. Don't worry. Just send in what you think. What are the key words using our step 1? Okay, somebody said volunteer. A lot of people are saying volunteer. But the problem with that, I want to point out why volunteer might not be one that is going to be helpful to us. The reason why, I think, is because most of us don't volunteer, right? It might be a good thing that we volunteer, but I think that this is one of those cases where you're going to say to me, I don't have an experience for that. Well, maybe you've never volunteered, but you probably have examples or experiences with some of the more general terms from the options, right? So let's take a look. Somebody said children. I definitely think that's one of them. Planting, that's definitely probably an idea, planting trees. Recycling, great. Garbage, okay, yeah, that's probably one of them too. If we don't have any idea, well, the thing is, just focus on what the keywords are here, and we'll talk about some strategies for that. Because this is where we're going to start to kind of see how you, even though you may not have experience with some of these elements, you may have another experience that you can kind of connect to this. So I hope that makes sense. Let's go on so that we can see what this means. Okay, so what I highlighted here was volunteer. So I did highlight that. It is an important word. It's not necessarily going to help me think of an experience. Personally, for myself, it's not going to. But I think that the other words here I've also highlighted. You'll see I've highlighted children, I've highlighted garbage, and I've highlighted trees. So I think that you can probably see that while maybe none of you have either volunteered in any of these areas, and maybe none of you have children, maybe none of you have done any of these things, the thing is you probably have experience with one of these 3 activities, or just one of these 3 concepts. Right? So you see, like children, if you have children, you probably can talk about an answer to this question. If you don't have children, you might have a harder time, but you could say when you were a child, right? Maybe you needed an after-school program and this would be good for you. Garbage, when we look at this one, for example, I think that probably none of you, or maybe some of you, have had recycling experience, but probably most of you have had experience with garbage, right? And just to illustrate this, I always use this example in my tutoring session. Right now, I live in Brooklyn, New York, and when I look outside of the window, I see garbage, right? I see it in the streets, and I see it in my neighborhood, and I think it's gross. I don't like it, right? So I can use that as my experience. Maybe I've never recycled before, but I think that I would answer this question well just from kind of describing my community. Right, telling my grader that in Brooklyn, New York, there's a lot of garbage on the street, so there's going to be a recycling program. I want to get involved, right? So that's very general, but I hope that gives you an idea. Same thing with trees, right? And just to illustrate how you can show the contrast of this, the positive side of this, for example, say you live in a community that is very well treed, meaning there's a lot of trees in the neighborhood. You might want to look out your window and say, well, I love my community. There's so many trees around, but I know that there are other communities that don't have trees. So this is how you can describe it. This is how you can use your personal experience to answer this question. right? It's something you probably never thought about before. I know it's something I never thought about before, and I know I've never done any of these things before necessarily. But the general concepts from each of these options, I do have experience with. And that's why when we call them familiar topics, I want you to know and have confidence that they are familiar topics. You just have to find the general aspect of the question and connect that to your life. And I hope that makes sense. Does anybody have a question about this element? Somebody says, coincidentally, I do have experience planting trees. That's excellent. You could certainly use that. But if you don't, I hope that makes sense. Somebody says, what if we don't know the keyword's meaning? Well, what I would say to that is, I mean, if you're not sure, for example, what volunteer means, then you're going to need to probably start working on your vocabulary. Because if you're not familiar with the question words or the words in the questions, then that's something that we'll have to definitely expand on and build. Right? You should feel comfortable with these questions. They shouldn't feel too advanced. And if they do, then you probably need work in your more fundamental level skills. This means grammar. This means vocabulary, right? Don't go to the exam if you're feeling like when you go to question 1 and 2, you don't know what they're asking you about. It shouldn't be that case. It shouldn't be that way. All right? Okay, so I got that question loads of times. I hope that answered your question. I'm not sure what this one question means. Maybe you can clarify. It says, with two example, or the high grade when I give 2 reason with 2 example, or 1 reason with 2 example. Okay, so to answer this question, there is no such rule, right? So just to let you know, the graders are not looking for a particular format. They're not looking for 1 reason, 2 reasons, 3 reasons, 4 examples. They're not looking for any of those things. But what Joseph and Noteful has created is a way in which you can comfortably answer. So when you give 2 reasons and 2 examples, you're much less likely to repeat, right? We know that. We've learned that from step 3. If you give 2 reasons, or I'm sorry, 1 reason, 2 examples, again, you're much less likely to repeat because you're telling me a different story that occurred. Right? Some of you in tutoring ask, well, can I just give 1 reason, 1 example? And again, this is something that's addressed in step 3 in great content. And it's something that, you know, if you feel this is the only way you can deliver an answer, then go for it. If, you know, one of the problems is, like we said, is repetition. We discourage it because of that. But if you feel that that's your only way, then do it. Don't make things up, because if you do, you're going to deliver an answer that's going to say, I did, and I went, and it's not going to be strong. No matter how hard you try, it's not going to be strong, right? There's too many pauses. There's too many fluency issues overall. So let's go on. Okay, so from this, I want to ask you, we talked about, you know, just some of the key concepts. We talked about some of the ways we can pull out the general vocabulary, how we can use them, right? How we can use the general vocabulary to apply that to our real life, or think about our real life. So what I wanted to ask you guys is if you could share with me, you know, some examples just based on garbage, some examples based on trees, some examples based on children. What are some of the things that you can say? Somebody says, the question seems that it is a very easy question, but in TOEFL conditions it will be very tricky. You're right, but the point is to master these skills. You're just learning them for the first time today, most likely, right? And if you haven't applied them before, then of course it's going to be tough, and of course it's going to take you time. So give it the time it needs, practice and review and master it. Okay, so somebody have, okay, teaching children. So if you're a teacher, if you've taught children, you can certainly do that. If you like natural atmosphere. Now, I want to highlight this one. Some people like to deliver answers about nature, right, that they like natural atmosphere. And I think that that's good, but you want to be careful because a lot of students tend to say, oh, I really like nature, I like the fresh air, I like the trees, I like the birds, I like the sky. And this is also a very basic answer. It's not very high level. And what you can do to shift that is talk about a time when you were in nature, because you're going to be using past tense, you're probably going to be using more verbs, and you're probably going to be just overall using more vocabulary, right? nursing sick people, that might be a little bit off topic, but what you could perhaps think about if you're going to use nursing sick people, you could say that people need companions, right? If people need companions, then you can talk about daycare programs with children, because a daycare program for children or after-school program is essentially about providing that companionship, right? So I hope that you see how you can actually connect something that seems very disconnected to an idea that this question is addressing. Trees decrease air pollution. Okay, trees decrease air pollution. So this is another one of those answers that I think that will tend to become more general, right? Just remember that if you're going to talk about air pollution, you can use high-level vocabulary like carbon dioxide, and you can talk about oxygen and things like that. But I just want you to know you should still follow the strategy, meaning example first. So when's the last time you were or saw or heard about a community that had either great pollution, or sorry, not great pollution, great air quality or poor pollution, right? You can think of that because we've all lived in areas, different places of the world, right? Some of you still live in your home countries, some of you live in America today, but you have more than one experience, right? You've seen the air quality. So tell me that story rather than just generally talking about that air pollution, right? Okay. I'm just trying to look quickly, but we're going to want to speed up now. This was kind of a longish lesson. So why is it important? That's the next step. So say, for example, you're thinking of your neighborhood and there's garbage all over the streets. You're asking yourself, why is this important? You might want to just say something as simple as because it's ugly, right? So you can say the reason to volunteer in this field would be because I think it will make the environment more beautiful, right? So I just want you to see how that can connect, right? Say, for example, you choose the children, right? And you have a story about, being a teacher. You're going to ask, why was this an important experience? You might want to say because it improved their education. So you're going to say, in your reason, I want to volunteer in this field because, first, it will improve education, right? So that's how you're going to build. All right, so from there, again, I want you to just write these down quickly. You have your when, you have your where, you have your who, what, why, and how. They kind of go together. All right, and remember that what is what happened, and what is essentially the most important part, because this is where you're going to expand on your reason idea. Right? You're not just going to say because it was faster. You're going to say because I spent 25 minutes going on the train to New York City, and if I drove, I probably would have gotten there in 2 seconds. That's an exaggerated story, but you understand, right? This is what happened. Don't just repeat the concept. Okay, so now we've answered a lot of questions, and this was supposed to be, the majority of the time was supposed to be a Q&A, but I wanted to really make sure you understood this concept because I think it's valuable. And I think that for those of you who are still struggling with question 1 and 2, you really need to start applying some of these strategies here and experimenting with them. I know probably some of you are doubtful because some of you have developed methods and patterns and just a way of going about things. But the problem is you need a score, right? And that's why we're here today. So if this is not, or if this is a problem for you, then you're going to need to try to experiment with new methods. And I personally feel that the ones that I've outlined today are very helpful once you've mastered them. So again, they do take time. They're not easy to just suddenly apply. Some students I've had where I've had a tutoring session, the student just applied it immediately, and I was impressed. I was like, wow. And actually, this just happened last week. And if you're out there, I'm sure you know who you are, because it was really amazing. But some students will take some practice, it will take some work, and that's okay. But just remember to apply it again and again and again. And I'm going to give you a homework assignment at the end, so don't worry, you're going to get a chance to experiment and work with it. So I have now some questions that I'd like to ask, or I knew you have some questions you'd like to ask, and I'm going to answer them. So let's take a look at some of your recent questions. I see a lot of you put in some really great examples, and I thought that that was excellent. So we're going to have more opportunity to do that with the homework. So just make sure that you hold on to those and add those examples you're coming up with right now. Add them to your checklist, or I'm sorry, cheat sheet. Add the examples you're coming up with right now, the reasons you're coming up with right now, to your reasons and examples cheat sheet, because remember that that's still a part of our overall strategy. Okay. So somebody says, this way of clarification make the questions in some way more practical. I agree. I really agree. So basically you're saying that first think of examples and then reasons. I am. That's exactly what I'm saying, right? Because when you think of it in the opposite direction, we often see some trouble with that, right? And we see some wasted time. It's not as effective, in my view, right? So let's go ahead. More questions. If I go through 180 examples, it will be most in the test. Well, the thing to know is 180 questions are from old tests. And we're not trying to, basically, I think that the problem is a lot of students, they look for questions so that they can see a question they'll see on the exam again. But what I want you to start looking at this as a way for you to build a strategy, a way for you to build a strategy that you can apply to whatever question you receive. So even though 180 questions may be a little older, and even though you might not see some of them on the TOEFL these days or in the future, just know that the strategies we're applying here are what you should practice with those questions, because the questions themselves don't matter. You know, the topics are always going to be pretty much the same. It's always education, it's always technology, right? That doesn't change. Maybe the style of the question varies a little bit, but it's always going to be the same kinds of topics, and therefore we're always going to have 15 seconds, right? We're always going to have 45 seconds to speak. So that's why we have to work to apply these strategies no matter what the question. Okay, how can we start the introduction part? Well, basically you're going to answer the question, right? So what we do is, if we go back to the question I asked before, which was about spending money on libraries or sports, you're going to say something like, I disagree that universities should spend more money on sports than libraries, right, for 2 reasons. And then you're going to go through your regular pattern like you normally would. And the question checklist that we discussed before is how you're going to go point by point through your answer, right? For example, when I was in, it was 1995. I was with my mother. And then you're going to start to say what happened, right? Okay. Somebody says, is there going to be another session on questions 3 and 4? Well, what we're trying to do now is try to have more regular webinars for all of you students out there, both self-study, review, and tutoring students, so that you can start to kind of get a little bit closer to some of the strategies to provide you with kind of like your own personal tutoring session. So they will be somewhat regular. We will let you know when the next one is coming up. Megan is going to also come on, and she's also going to host some classes too, so we're excited about that. Somebody said, is why part is important? In the question checklist, I think you're talking about, yes, it is important, because the final sentence of your example is going to connect, right? It's going to say, so because I spent money on that book, I think universities should spend more money on libraries, not on sports, right? That's basically your why you think it's important, or how it connects back to that answer, okay? Somebody's going, please. I don't know what that refers to, but I would be glad to answer the question. Okay, what's next? Okay, if I don't finish my conclusion sentence on time, will it hurt my score? The thing is, you know, of course we're always going to try to shoot for the conclusion, but if I personally feel that if you don't have a conclusion there, if you're missing it, you know, a grader's not going to give you a 23, right? If you did really perfectly all the way up to that point, and you know you forget your conclusion, it's not going to take you from a 26 to a 23. There's no way, right? It's just not possible. Your goal here is to demonstrate your fluency, and part of the reason why we have a conclusion is because it shows that you can complete an idea. It shows that you have control, and it also allows you to kind of demonstrate that you have a control of the time management. All right, so that's why I think it's important. Will it be a major loss to your score? Not necessarily. All right. Somebody's asking, complete TOEFL Mastery included personal help for each section from Noteful like this class. Complete TOEFL Mastery is a self-study system, so it's not going to include personal tutoring or reviews, but we will hold classes like this, so whenever you can participate, be sure to try to come. And if you can't, remember that we always add them to the system later so that you can participate, indirectly. And if you feel that you need tutoring, more one-on-one tutoring with either Joseph, myself, or Megan, just let us know, and we'll be glad to help you upgrade or register for the tutoring. Okay, somebody says, if you have a problem with reading or listening, can you guys create a class for me? Well, we are hoping to also integrate reading and listening into these webinars, so keep on the lookout for that. If you need reading and listening tutoring, though, be sure to register, okay? Be sure to register, because that's going to be a little bit different. If you need the help, then get it. Somebody's asking about their personal scores here. Now, one of the things I just want to urge against, I know this is a Q&A, but I want to resist answering the questions about recommendations. And the reason why is because these are your personal scores, and it's going to be a little bit too specific for the purpose of this webinar. So if you need a recommendation, if you're here because you're considering, taking classes or upgrading or something, or you don't know how long it's going to take you to study, please send us an email with your specific details, because that's a little bit personalized, and I want to give you the attention that you deserve, okay? I'm taking a look and seeing if there's any more questions. I think before coming up with an example, we should find a clear position about question. Well, that's your opinion, and you can definitely use that. If you feel that you have more success with answer first, then reason, then example, then that's fine. But that's not the purpose of this webinar, right? The purpose of this webinar is the fact that most of you are doing that, and most of you are not having it's not as easy for you as you had hoped, right? So I'm trying to give you an alternative to that. I personally don't feel that it's easier to answer questions than reasons than examples, because I think for the reasons I explained before, if you're spending time thinking of your answer to your question, then you're probably spending your time inefficiently. 15 seconds is not long, right? Your examples are the most important part. So if you're not spending your 15 seconds on that, then you may not be spending your time effectively. So that's what this basically is all about, right? So experiment with it if you want. If you don't want to, that's perfectly fine too. It's all about your success. Okay, so somebody's telling me they always use their 15 seconds to think of their reasons. So that basically is what I just talked about just now, right? Again, your reasons are just a sentence. They're not the chunk of your answer. And the reason sentence doesn't matter in the sense that your grader is not necessarily going to judge you on your reason. Your grader is going to judge you on the level of content you present throughout your response, right? So if you're spending your 15 seconds kind of going, what do I think? Why do I think? What do I think? Why do I think? You're going to be spending your time inefficiently. It's the example part that is where you're going to really show the grader your level of your ability, right? Your English ability. So that's why I created this. Okay, I'm going to see if I have time for just a couple more questions. Okay, okay. Okay, so somebody is talking to me about the step 3 about the cheat sheets. I know one particular student is very concerned about the cheat sheet. If you watch the videos, you'll see that we discuss cheat sheets. I promise you it's all there. Students who have been with Noteful for a long time are probably familiar with this, but if you haven't watched those videos in a while, review them, because that's where it discusses a cheat sheet, and it also discusses what that means, okay? Somebody wants to know about transition, but I don't know what that means. Please explain. What do you mean by a transition? Somebody asks, will you have any session on IELTS? Well, IELTS is something that's coming. It's something that I know that some of you, if you have been trying to take the IELTS, it's something that's going to be down the road. But one thing I just want to let you know is for the IELTS, you know, there's a speaking section as well. And some of these questions are going to be kind of similar. So some of these strategies we talked about today may be relevant to you. Right? Answering with a question list in your mind, that can definitely help you deliver responses to IELTS questions. So I just want you to know that what you learned here today can certainly be of use. Okay, I'm getting some of the same questions again and again. So I'm going to try to skip ahead a little bit. I see a lot coming in. Okay. Can I say only 3 sentences in the example which answers all questions in the checklist? You probably can, but I think that it will maybe be a little tight. I'm sure that you probably can. You may want to practice it. I think that you'll want to practice it, but just make sure that your sentences aren't too complex, because if they are, then you may have trouble with grammar. So simplify it for yourself. You might want to just break it down into smaller sentences if possible. I know you're going to want to experiment with your time management, and that'll probably be affected by your speed, right? So practice, experiment, what works for you. Somebody wants to know how to improve their reading score. Well, this is a very broad question, and it's a very different question. So if you need to improve your reading score, then you're going to need to start by following steps 1, 2, and 3, and that's where you're going to start. And if you have a specific question about your reading, right, if you have a specific question about, you know, the step-by-step process, maybe it's strategy, maybe it's vocabulary, maybe it's comprehension, maybe you saw something in your system that you don't understand, that's when you're going to want to start writing in with your questions, okay? Because improving reading is super broad. It's just like saying, how do I improve English, right? I can tell you many ways in which you can improve it. So be specific in your questions. And that's actually a good piece of advice I just want to share with all of you. When you're asking questions through emails, make sure you get specific. Try to avoid those general questions, because when you ask general questions, it shows that you may not really even know what you need help with. And looking through your system, you will find that you experience difficulty with certain elements. You'll find that you experience ease with other elements, meaning some parts are easier. So be more aware of yourself. Know what your strengths are. Know what your weaknesses are. And when you know what your weaknesses are, then ask in or write in with those questions, not just what do I do about my reading, right? Because that's super broad. Anything else? Somebody asks about homework. Right, so I know that we're going to have to cut this short now. I hope I gave you a lot of good answers. If you have more answers, or I'm sorry, if you have more questions, please write in. But we're going to end the session now, and I'm going to give you your homework. It's just very straightforward. All right, and all of you who have a system will know what to do. All right, so your homework is, go ahead and select 10 questions from 180 question lists. All right, this is in step 2. Right, practice using the strategies we discussed today. All right, these points, just so you know, they are also now in your Are You Ready section. I dropped my Y, sorry about that. They're in your Are You Ready section. So, for example, when you look at the question that says, under speaking, that says, can you think of examples and reasons? You're going to see that one of the answers to those questions is example first strategy. Right, you're also going to see using general words or keywords from the question to think of your examples. So you're going to see that that's all there for you now. And this webinar is going to go in the system as well, so you'll have this as a resource to refer back to. But I hope you took great notes today. And if you have any questions about how to go through the strategy again, please feel free to write in. The next step, just remember to keep at it until you've mastered the strategies. A lot of you in tutoring sessions always ask the question, how long is it going to take? Will I be ready by this specific time? Can I do it in 2 months? Remember, you're all individuals. You're all coming to this exam with different limitations, not just in time, but in the way you learn. Right? So, for example, I could give student A a timing activity and they could finish it and master it in a week, whereas maybe student B needs to take a month, right? So that question is not always the easiest question to answer. And I just want you to know that basically what our mantra is, what our rule is, what we always say to students is keep at it until you've mastered the strategies. Have confidence that these strategies do work. We've seen them work with students, and that's where they come from. Not a single strategy in your system comes from air, right? All of these strategies that Joseph's created, that I've created, that Megan's created, that Aaron is creating in ESL Power, they come from real experience with students like yourself. They come from tutoring sessions. They come from reviews. And we create them because we've seen students fail in certain areas, and we've seen students succeed with new strategies. So remember, you have to keep at them until they're mastered. All right, and if you've worked on it for like a month or something and you're just not getting it, then you may want to try something else. I don't want you to waste your time, but I have a lot of confidence in this strategy because I've seen it work with myself, with other instructors, and with other students. All right, so I just want to give you that confidence. All right, so remember, we're here for you. We wish you the best of luck. With this homework, you can work on it. You can, of course, submit it if you need a little bit of help with the strategy. I wish you the best of luck. Thank you so much for attending, and take care, guys.